Get out!
Revenge Files with Nora. File 32. Elizabeth. Imagine this. You're standing in a glass-walled conference room on the 41st floor of a Manhattan high-rise. 32 people are seated around the table: partners, senior associates, department heads. And the managing partner picks up your 12-page report, the one you spent 9 years building the framework for, holds it up so everyone can see the title, and calls it Insignificant Paperwork. Then he drops it into the recycling bin. A few people shift in their seats. A couple of them actually laugh. And if you've ever had your work dismissed like it meant nothing, you already know exactly how this feels. Now imagine you're watching this happen, and you know something no one else in that room does. That report documents $6.2 million in regulatory violations he personally authorized. Every page time-stamped. Every transaction flagged. Every file backed up on a secure server only you can access. He thinks tossing it made it disappear. He thinks wrong. Within 12 months, federal investigators walked into that same conference room. And the man who threw my report in the trash, he was sitting across from SEC enforcement attorneys, answering questions he couldn't dodge with a recycling bin. Here's what happened. My name is Elizabeth Sutherland, and for 9 years I was the lead compliance analyst at Hargrove and Merritt Financial Advisory, a mid-tier wealth management firm headquartered in a glass tower in Tribeca. The kind of firm that managed portfolios for orthodontists who had done well and tech founders who had cashed out early, not Goldman Sachs territory, but respectable. Solid. The sort of place where people stayed because the culture rewarded diligence over flash. I joined straight from completing my certification in financial compliance. My first week, the previous compliance officer, a man named Gerald who was 3 months from retirement, handed me a filing cabinet key and said, "The regulators don't come often, but when they do, you want every piece of paper in order." I took that advice and built my entire career around it. By year 4, I had digitized the firm's entire compliance infrastructure. By year 6, I had built a flagging system that caught discrepancies before they became audit findings. The firm passed 3 consecutive SEC examinations with 0 deficiencies, something the partners mentioned in every client pitch deck. My work was not glamorous. It did not generate revenue, but it kept the lights on in the most fundamental way possible. It kept the firm legal. The firm's original managing partner, Howard Hargrove, understood that. He was old school in the best sense. Believed that a financial advisory firm's first product was trust, and trust required clean books. Howard retired when I was in my 7th year, and for a few months, the firm operated on autopilot under the remaining partners. Then the board brought in Duncan Prescott. Duncan came from a larger firm where he had been an executive director focused on client acquisition. His reputation preceded him. Aggressive growth targets, a talent for landing high net worth clients, and a documented allergy to anything that slowed revenue generation. The partners were thrilled, inexplicably so, in my opinion. The firm needed new energy, they said, someone who could push Hargrove and Merritt into the next tier. I met Duncan during his first week. He called a department town hall in the main conference room on the 41st floor, the one with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Hudson. He wore a charcoal suit with no tie and spoke for 20 minutes without notes. His vision was clear: double the assets under management within 3 years, expand the advisory team by 40%, and position the firm for a potential merger or acquisition. When I introduced myself afterward, Elizabeth Sutherland, lead compliance analyst, he shook my hand without making eye contact and said, "Right, the paperwork department." Then he turned to the next person in line. We all know someone like this. The kind of person who confuses authority with intelligence. I did not take it personally. Not at first. Compliance officers are accustomed to being the least popular people in any financial firm. People find it off-putting that we say no, flag delays, and require signatures. So you could say I was used to similar attitudes. But over the following months, Duncan's dismissiveness evolved into something more calculated. First came the budget cuts. My department had operated with 3 staff members. Duncan reduced it to 1, me. Streamlining operations, he called it during a casual hallway conversation, as though eliminating 2/3 of a regulatory function was no different from canceling a magazine subscription. Then came the access restrictions. Certain client account modifications began routing around my review process entirely. I would discover transactions after they had already been processed, which defeated the purpose of a compliance checkpoint. I raised these concerns in writing, 3 separate emails to Duncan, each copied to the operations director. The responses were variations of the same deflection. Noted, we will circle back. Nobody circled back. The changes were not just procedural. The firm's risk profile was shifting beneath our feet. Duncan brought in a cluster of new clients, the kind with complex offshore structures and multiple LLC tickets layered between the beneficial owner and the underlying assets. Nothing inherently illegal about that, but exactly the type of arrangement that demands enhanced due diligence under the Bank Secrecy Act. When I requested the documentation to complete those reviews, Duncan's assistant told me the files were being compiled. Weeks turned into months. The files never materialized. The number of irregularities had grown so much that I realized I had no choice but to document every request and every non-response. My goal was not to build a case file, not at first. I was simply doing what a compliance analyst does, documenting. It is reflexive. It is part of the job. The thing about documentation is that most people see it as bureaucracy, paper generated for the sake of paper. But in regulated environments, documentation is the difference between a firm that survives an investigation and one that collapses under it. I understood that from my first day. Duncan Prescott never would. What troubled me most was not Duncan's attitude. Arrogance in leadership is unpleasant but survivable. What troubled me was the pattern forming beneath the surface. I began noticing irregularities in the fee schedules, small at first, the kind of thing that could be attributed to administrative error. A client billed at 1.2% instead of the agreed 1%. An account charged a performance fee that was not specified in the advisory agreement. Individually, each discrepancy was minor. Collectively, across dozens of accounts, they formed a current that was pulling in one direction, toward revenue that the firm had not earned and the clients had not authorized. I flagged each one through the internal system, created a tracking spreadsheet with dates, account numbers, amounts, and the relevant contractual terms. I sent monthly summaries to Duncan's office. Each month, the same response. Acknowledged, filed, no action taken. By my 8th year at the firm, I had accumulated over 200 individual compliance flags, all acknowledged, none resolved. The firm's clean examination record, the one the partners loved to advertise, was becoming fiction. We were not compliant. We were lucky. And luck in the securities industry has an expiration date. I remember a conversation with Calvin Abrams, one of the senior financial advisors, during a late afternoon in the break room on 39. Calvin was one of the few people at the firm who treated compliance as a partner rather than an obstacle. He poured his coffee, sat across from me, and said, "Elizabeth, I have clients asking me questions I cannot answer. About fees. About trades they did not authorize. Something is off." "I know," I said. "Have you told Duncan?" 16 times in writing. Calvin looked at me in disbelief and set his cup down. "And he files my emails the way most people file spam, acknowledged and ignored." Calvin was quiet for a moment. Then he said something I would remember for a long time. "There's a difference between a firm that has compliance problems and a firm that knows about compliance problems and chooses to do nothing. The second one does not survive the investigation." He was right, and the investigation was coming. Duncan just did not know it yet. That conversation happened on a Wednesday. The budget planning session, the one that changed everything, was scheduled for the following Tuesday. I spent the weekend refining my compliance report, organizing it into 3 clear sections, printing clean copies for every attendee. I believed, perhaps naively, that presenting the data in a formal setting with witnesses would force acknowledgement. I was half right. It forced acknowledgement. Just not the kind I expected. The budget planning session happened on a Tuesday in March. 32 people were present. I counted because the attendance sheet was one of my responsibilities. The conference room on 41 was arranged boardroom style, partners and directors at the main table, department heads lining the perimeter. Duncan sat at the head, flanked by his chief of staff and the new business development director he had recruited from his previous firm. My portion of the agenda was scheduled for 11 minutes. I had prepared a 12-page compliance status report covering 3 areas: outstanding regulatory documentation for the new client accounts, a pattern of fee discrepancies I had identified over the previous quarter, and a summary of upcoming SEC examination preparation requirements. I made it to page 3. Duncan had been scrolling through his phone while I spoke, not unusual behavior for him. But when I began outlining the fee discrepancies, specifically the pattern of advisory fees being charged at rates above what client agreements authorized, he held up his hand. "Elizabeth," he said my name the way people say anyway when they want to redirect the conversation. "I appreciate the thoroughness, but can we stay focused? We are here to discuss the budget, not audit findings." "These are not audit findings," I said. "They are compliance observations that require remediation before the next examination cycle." "Before what, exactly?" He picked up my report from the table, held it between his thumb and forefinger like something that had expired in the back of a refrigerator. "This is insignificant paperwork. Every firm has minor discrepancies. We address them in the normal course of business." Then he dropped it, not on the table, into the recycling bin beside his chair. 32 people watched. Nobody spoke. I felt heat crawling up the back of my neck, but I kept my voice even. "I would recommend we discuss this in a private setting. I would recommend we move to the revenue projections," Duncan said, and the meeting moved on. After the session, 2 people approached me separately. Calvin Abrams caught my arm near the elevator bank. "That was wrong," he said quietly. "What he did in there, that was wrong." "Thank you," I said. "Are the discrepancies serious?" he asked. "I believe they are. I need more access to confirm the full scope." Calvin nodded slowly. "If you need anything from the advisory side, account records, client communications, anything, come directly to me." The second person was David Kessler, a junior analyst who had been sitting in the back row. He found me in the break room an hour later, looking like he had spent the entire hour debating whether to say anything. He approached hesitantly, glancing around nervously. "Miss Sutherland, I have noticed some things in the portfolio accounting system. Transactions that do not match the client authorizations on file. I was not sure who to tell." "Document what you have seen," I said. "Dates, transaction details, account numbers. And please send it to my secure email, not the firm's general system." David's information arrived that evening. 14 transactions across 6 client accounts where the executed trades did not correspond to the documented client instructions. In 3 of those cases, the unauthorized trades had generated losses that were subsequently absorbed by transferring funds from other client accounts. That practice has a specific name in securities regulation: commingling of client assets. It is not a minor discrepancy. It is not an administrative error. It is a federal violation under the Investment Advisors Act. I spent the next 3 weeks conducting the most intensive analysis of my career. Early mornings before the trading floor opened. Late nights after the custodial staff had finished their rounds, cross-referencing transaction logs against client authorization forms, advisory agreements, and fee schedules. The pattern that emerged was not random. It was systematic. Someone, and the authorization codes pointed to a very specific someone, had been overcharging clients on advisory fees, executing trades without proper authorization, and shuffling money between accounts to paper over the discrepancies. The total exposure was not small. My preliminary calculation, conservative by design, estimated $6.2 million in cumulative regulatory violations over an 18-month period, and every authorization code in the chain traced back to one office, Duncan Prescott's. I compiled everything into a 63-page report, every finding documented with exhibits, every transaction cross-referenced with the relevant regulatory requirement, every timeline verified against multiple data sources. I titled it Internal Compliance Review, Urgent Remediation Required, and submitted it through the firm's official compliance reporting channel, which by policy was supposed to route simultaneously to the managing partner and the board's audit committee. Duncan intercepted it. I know this because 24 hours after submission, I received an email, not from the audit committee, but from Duncan's chief of staff. The message read, "Per the managing partner's direction, your report has been received and will be reviewed at the appropriate time. No further action is needed from your department. Please focus on routine compliance duties moving forward." No further action. Focus on routine duties. You know what that really means, don't you? In corporate language, it translates clearly, "Stop digging." I did not stop. Not even close. There is a moment in every compliance professional's career when you discover that the system you built to protect the firm is being used against you. The reporting channels, the escalation procedures, the documentation protocols, they function only when the people at the top permit them to function. When leadership decides that compliance is inconvenient, those systems become decoration. Wallpaper over structural damage. I had spent 9 years believing that internal documentation was sufficient protection, that filing the right reports through the right channels would, eventually, force the right outcome. But documentation without accountability is just archived paper. Duncan had made it clear that internal accountability was suspended indefinitely. I had reached the limit of what I could do on my own. I needed external help. I needed an attorney, but I was facing an important decision. I asked myself whether I truly wanted to keep pursuing this. How much further was I willing to go? I had more than enough reason to walk away. My boss had publicly humiliated me in front of 32 colleagues. Then my own company had buried the evidence I uncovered. There was no reason I should keep fighting for this firm and putting myself at risk. What would you do? I was not afraid of Duncan. But I also knew what going external would mean. It would mean crossing a line that could not be uncrossed. The moment you take your evidence outside the firm's walls, you stop being a loyal employee raising internal concerns and become something else entirely. You become a threat. And threatened organizations do not respond with gratitude, they respond with lawyers. I went home that night and sat in my apartment in Murray Hill, staring at the 63-page report. I could no longer recognize the company I had worked at for 9 years. I thought about Gerald, the man who had given me that filing cabinet key in my first days. "You want every piece of paper in order," he had said. I had kept every piece of paper in order, filed every report, sent every email, and flagged every discrepancy. I had never compromised on my diligence, always striving to fulfill the demands of my profession. And the reward for that was a recycling bin and an email telling me to focus on routine duties. As I thought about the good old days at work, the question shifted from should I to how. Even though I was angry, I needed to set emotion aside. It could lead to mistakes. I had to be methodical. The next morning, I called a contact from law school and asked for one name: the best whistleblower attorney in New York who specialized in securities regulation under Dodd-Frank. She gave me Margaret Chen's number. I called Margaret's office the following morning from a bench outside the Tribeca Whole Foods, because I was not about to make that call from inside the building. Her assistant answered, took my name, and told me Margaret could meet on Thursday. 2 days away. 2 days of walking into that office, riding the elevator to 41, sitting at my desk across from Duncan's closed door, and pretending that everything was normal. 2 days of smiling at colleagues who had watched my report land in the trash and said nothing. Those were the longest 2 days of my professional life. Margaret Chen's office was on the 4th floor of a brownstone near Union Square, the kind of building you could walk past 1,000 times without noticing. No polished lobby. No receptionist in designer glasses. Just a narrow staircase, a frosted glass door, and a brass plate that read, Chen and Associates, Securities Litigation. Margaret told me later that her most effective weapon was that opposing counsel consistently underestimated her. The modesty of the space was intentional and strategic. I appreciated that approach. Our first meeting lasted 2 hours. I brought the 63-page report, the intercepted email from Duncan's chief of staff, my tracking spreadsheet of 200 unresolved compliance flags, and an iron key encrypted USB drive containing every piece of supporting documentation, transaction logs, email chains, fee schedules, client authorization forms. Margaret reviewed the materials methodically, turning pages without expression, occasionally marking something with a red pen. When she finished, she set the report down and looked at me directly. How confident are you in the $6.2 million figure? Conservative, I said. That covers the 18 months I was able to fully analyze. If the pattern extends further back, which I believe it does based on gaps in the earlier records, the actual exposure could approach 12 million. Margaret picked up her pen again and drew a single line under a number on her legal pad. You have already done most of the SEC to Kess work for them. That is not typical. I am a compliance analyst. Building the case file is literally what I do. Building the internal case file, yes, she said, but most compliance professionals stop at the first blocked escalation. You documented the obstruction itself, which is a separate category of violation. That changes the calculus significantly. Margaret walked me through the Dodd-Frank whistleblower framework with the precision of someone who had navigated it dozens of times. Under the Act, I could file a tip directly with the SEC to Kess office of the whistleblower using Form TCR. The information had to meet 4 criteria: original, specific, credible, and timely. If my tip led to a successful enforcement action resulting in monetary sanctions exceeding $1 million, I would be eligible for a financial award between 10% and 30% of the sanctions collected. The potential award was meaningful, but Margaret was careful to frame it as a secondary consideration. The primary protection, she said, is anti-retaliation under Section 21F. The moment you file with the SEC, Dodd-Frank prohibits your employer from firing you, demoting you, suspending you, or harassing you in connection with your protected activity. If they do, that becomes an additional enforcement matter. They are probably planning to restructure my position out of existence, I said. What do I do in that case? Margaret smiled, not warmly, but with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had heard this exact scenario before. Constructive elimination of a whistleblower's role within 12 months of a regulatory filing creates a strong presumption of retaliation. If they are already building the paper trail to justify eliminating your position, we want the SEC filing on record before they pull that trigger. Timing matters. How much time do we have? Based on what you have described? Weeks, not months. We spent the next 10 days refining my submission. Margaret had me restructure certain sections to align with what she knew the Enforcement Division prioritized: authorization chain analysis, evidence of management awareness, and documentation of obstruction. She added legal context that transformed my compliance report into a formal regulatory complaint. The final submission was 81 pages, supported by over 200 individually numbered exhibits. I signed the Form TCR on a Thursday afternoon in June in Margaret's office under penalty of perjury. I was still resolute, but I will not pretend the weight of that signature was light. I was about to formally accuse the managing partner of my firm of federal securities violations. I had no doubt, but this was a profoundly serious decision. I was filing a whistleblower complaint. Even though I had no question that my decision was right, I was scared. It was not a triumphant moment. It was a quiet one. A pen on paper, a confirmation number on a screen, and then silence. The SEC does not acknowledge receipt in any meaningful way. You file your Form TCR, you receive a submission number, and then you wait. Margaret warned me. Investigations take months, sometimes years. The SEC is deliberate, she said. They will not act until their case is airtight, but when they move, the response is comprehensive. In the meantime, I continued going to work. Every morning, I rode the same elevator up to the same floor. I walked past Duncan's office. I acted as though everything were normal, but nothing was normal. In July, my access to the portfolio management system was further restricted. In August, my budget for external compliance training was eliminated. A colleague I had worked alongside for 6 years stopped including me in department emails without explanation. In September, Duncan's chief of staff informed me that my role was under strategic review and that the firm was exploring outsourced compliance solutions. I recognized the architecture of what was happening. They were constructing a business justification to eliminate my position, not as retaliation, which would be legally actionable, but as an organizational restructuring. It is a common tactic, and one that Margaret had anticipated with surgical precision. She instructed me to document every communication related to the restructuring every shift in my responsibilities, every meeting I was excluded from. I did exactly that. Calvin Abrams remained a steady, quiet ally through those months. He would occasionally forward me client communications that contradicted the authorized trading patterns, nothing dramatic, nothing that pointed to a deliberate leak, just a steady accumulation of evidence that the violations I had reported were ongoing and expanding. He never asked directly what I was doing with the information. I think he understood. In October, something changed. A letter arrived at my apartment, not at the firm, from the SEC Division of Enforcement. Addressed to me personally, bearing a case reference number, requesting my availability for a voluntary interview at the SEC New York Regional Office in Lower Manhattan. The investigation was not just open. It was active. Documentation does not care about corporate hierarchy or quarterly revenue targets or managing partner egos. A timestamped transaction log does not become less damning because someone powerful called it insignificant. And when a federal agency with subpoena authority begins pulling threads, every dismissed report, every buried email, every blocked escalation becomes evidence, not of compliance failure, but of deliberate obstruction. That distinction matters. It is the difference between a fine and a permanent industry bar. Margaret and I spent 3 days preparing for the interview. Even though I tried not to show it, she could see I was nervous. She anticipated every potential question, briefed me on the boundaries of testimony, and repeated one instruction until it became instinct. Answer precisely what is asked. Do not speculate. Do not editorialize. Let the documents speak. The interview took place in a conference room on the 28th floor of the SEC Regional Office on Vesey Street. 2 enforcement attorneys and a forensic accountant sat across the table with my 81-page submission and a stack of their own files. They had clearly been working with my documentation for months because their questions referenced specific transaction numbers, specific dates, specific authorization codes that I had flagged. At one point, the lead enforcement attorney leaned forward and asked, "Miss Sutherland, when your internal compliance report was intercepted by the managing partner's office and you were instructed to cease further review, did you believe the firm's senior leadership was aware of the underlying violations?" "I did not believe it," I said. "I documented it. There is a difference." The attorney paused, wrote something on her legal pad, and moved to the next question. The SEC investigation expanded rapidly after my interview. Subpoenas were issued for electronic communications going back 24 months. In November, 3 additional firm employees were contacted for voluntary testimony, including David Kessler, whose independent documentation of unauthorized trading patterns corroborated my findings without any coordination between us. In December, the SEC issued formal document preservation notices to Hargrove and Merritt. In the securities industry, receiving a preservation notice from the Commission is the equivalent of hearing a lock click shut behind you. Duncan's behavior at the firm became erratic. He canceled 2 scheduled client events without explanation. He retained personal legal counsel, a detail I learned not from office gossip but from Margaret, who recognized the attorney's name in a procedural SEC filing. The board of directors, which had been largely dormant since Duncan's appointment, convened an emergency session in January. I was not invited. I did not need to be. The formal enforcement action was announced in March, almost exactly 12 months after Duncan had dropped my compliance report into that recycling bin. The SEC complaint named both Hargrove and Merritt Financial Advisory as an entity and Duncan Prescott individually. The charges were comprehensive: failure to implement adequate compliance controls, unauthorized trading in client accounts, systematic fee overcharges, commingling of client assets, and the charge that carried the most weight: obstruction of internal compliance reporting processes. The total monetary sanctions exceeded $8.4 million, higher than my conservative estimate because the SEC forensic team had uncovered additional violations, predating my initial 18-month analysis by nearly a year. Duncan had been running variations of the same scheme at his previous firm and had simply imported the playbook to Hargrove and Merritt when the board gave him the keys. Duncan's attorneys negotiated a settlement that included a permanent industry bar, not a suspension. Not a fine with continued licensing, a permanent prohibition from serving in any supervisory capacity at a registered investment firm. For a man who had built his identity around being a managing partner, it was a professional extinction event. After a long and difficult process, we had succeeded. The firm survived, but under conditions that made the old Hargrove and Merritt unrecognizable. The remaining partners agreed to a consent order requiring complete restructuring of compliance functions, a 3-year independent monitoring period, and full restitution to affected clients. The cost of Duncan's 18 months of streamlined operations exceeded the firm's total revenue for the same period. I received a call from Margaret in April. Her voice carried the particular calm of someone delivering news she had been waiting months to confirm. "The SEC has processed your Whistleblower Award determination," she said. "Based on the sanctions collected in the enforcement action, you are eligible for a substantial payment. I will have the exact figure within the week." The figure, when it arrived, was $1.26 million. What it represented went far beyond just a number for me. The SEC had determined that my information was original, that it had directly led to the enforcement action, and that my cooperation had been exemplary. Every flagged transaction, every email sent into a void of corporate indifference. The federal government weighed it all and determined that it mattered. Calvin Abrams texted me the day the enforcement action went public. "The Insignificant Paperwork won." I saved that message. It sits in a folder on my phone alongside the attendance sheet from that budget planning session. 32 names. 32 people who learned that a compliance report does not stop being valid because a managing partner puts it in the trash. It has been 8 months since the settlement was finalized. I no longer work at Hargrove and Merritt, not because they forced me out, but because I chose to leave. Margaret connected me with a regulatory consulting practice that advises mid-sized financial firms on compliance infrastructure. My title is Director of Compliance Strategy, and my clients are the firms that want to build systems capable of catching problems before the SEC does. Duncan Prescott's name surfaces occasionally in industry publications, always in the context of enforcement case studies. I do not follow his movements. The permanent bar speaks on its own. David Kessler was promoted at Hargrove and Merritt. Calvin Abrams left for a larger advisory firm. Over coffee last month, he told me that the firm's compliance department has actual authority, an actual budget, and a managing partner who reads every report that crosses his desk. The firm's founding partner, Howard Hargrove, sent me a handwritten note. "Gerald would have been proud of you." The lesson I carry is not that the system always works. It does not. The system works when someone forces it to, when someone assembles the documentation that should matter, delivers it to the people whose job is to act on it, and refuses to accept dismissal as a final answer. That is not heroism. That is compliance done all the way to its conclusion. Do you agree? Share your thoughts in the comments. The full yellow file playlist's waiting, or discover other color files for more office revenge. See you in the next file.